Hey, if we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name's Garry. I'm one of the pastors here. So glad that you decided to tune in on a Sunday morning in January. It's great to have you with us. Just a reminder, keep sending those pictures in. It's so encouraging to know that there's people out there actually tuning in, taking the service in, and it helps us feel connected even though we're not together. So just send those pictures to the address on the screen, admin@themeetingplace.org, and we'll get them on that pre-service roll. If when you tune in, those will be scrolling by, and you might even see yourself and give yourself a wave. A couple of updates for you. First off, again, Lori and I really appreciate your thoughts, your prayers, your encouragement and support over the last few weeks as I've recovered from heart surgery. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It is people like you that makes this church so awesome. And we love you guys, and thanks again for that. Tomorrow marks 7 weeks, which is weird. I was talking with some of the people down here where we're doing this. It's 7 weeks tomorrow since my operation, which just is mind-boggling. Like, where does the time go? And one last update. In case you're wondering, we've entered into this phase 2 of reopening British Columbia. What does that mean for us as a church and going maybe possibly back to the theater? First off, I just want you to know that the staff and leadership are staying on top of this. Our conference is actually in meetings with Bonnie Henry and Adrian Dix on a weekly basis to see what their thoughts are, what their recommendations are. So right now where we're at, the theaters aren't even allowed to open yet. That doesn't happen until phase 3, which they're anticipating maybe mid-June, July kind of thing, but it's all in flux with numbers and all that. It's all dependent on that. But there still will be restrictions on crowd size, 50 or less. Which means you have to subtract everyone else that's supporting the service, musicians, sound people, and all that. They are recommending, although it's not going to be enforced at this point, they are recommending no singing. But if you do sing, to actually double the spacing from 6 feet to 12 feet, which even reduces our seating even more. So all that to say that as it stands right now, the leadership and staff, we aren't anticipating a return to the theater anytime soon, maybe later this year. And that's why it's so important to get plugged into a connection group so we can keep connecting with one another, meeting with one another, sharing what's going on in our lives with one another. So if you haven't got into a group yet, make sure you go to the website and check that out. Fill out the form. We will get you plugged in somewhere. If you want to start a group, we'll even help you do that. So make sure you do that. Connection groups are super important. Now, having said all that, everything could change like tomorrow. Which is nothing new for us these days, it seems. We have gone through a lot of change. And I think it's safe to say that the last few months, man, they have been surreal, if not unreal. I mean, think about this. There's no professional sports. Like, I remember Peter, our youth pastor, texting me saying they just suspended the NHL season. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no international travel. Borders between countries are closed. Like having the U.S.-Canada border closed is like, it's never happened before. And something's up when Disneyland closes its doors, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I have done my best to try and stay optimistic through this whole thing. But I got to admit, there are days, when I maybe get wrapped up on a news story and I get thinking about this stuff and all the changes that we've been through and this new normal, this talk of this new normal that we're stepping into. Man, when I do that, I just start to feel so overwhelmed and almost sad. Here's an example. Get this. This still kind of boggles my mind. In early April, just before I went in for surgery, my wife, Lori, and I were sitting down watching a movie on Netflix. I don't even remember what the movie was called, but I do remember the scene that I watched. And it was a scene that took place in a nightclub. And it was packed. There was people dancing and, clinking their glasses and all that. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm sitting on my chair going, hey, you guys aren't social distancing. Like, now that may sound weird or lame or whatever, but I'm just being honest with you. It threw me emotionally. And here's why. I suddenly became very aware of how much I had adapted to this new, if not bizarre, normal. And I call it bizarre because who would have thought just a couple of months ago that you would get away with walking into a bank with a mask on? Like, really, think about that for a second. We have gone through a ton of change. And as English poet William Cooper once penned, he said this, and you've heard these words before, variety's the very spice of life that gives it all its flavor. You know what? He's right. It's true. And I'm all for variety, which is really just another way of saying change. Change is variety. But there's another saying that says, too much of a good thing isn't good for you. And if variety, change, is good, well, I don't know. For me, I've had too much. I'm ready for things to go back to normal, to old normal. And maybe the same is true for you. I mean, man, I miss you guys a lot. I don't like speaking to a camera. I want to be able to be in the same room with you and feel that energy, to see you, to hear you. I want us to go back to the theater where we can be together. I want us to be able to have one of our epic TMP barbecue picnics in the park. I want to be able to go for a coffee with you and sit down and talk and chat and see what's happening in life. I want to go for a walk. I want to hang out at the food court after a service and have lunch. And I want to be able to do all of that without having to social distance. I've talked with a lot of people over the last few weeks, and they're much like me. We just want things to go back to normal, back to the way they were. And you know what? It's not all that surprising, because research shows that we humans tend to think about the past with a more positive bias than we think about the present. It's almost like it's an escapism for us, to escape the pressures of today, the present. Here's what I mean. All of us, to some degree, have things in our life that are annoying. And if you're married, don't look at your spouse, but just, there's things in our life that are annoying, right? Or stressful. There's bills to be paid. They just seem to keep coming. There's stacks of laundry to be sorted and then washed and then dried and folded and ironed and hung. There's dishes to be done, dishwashers to unload and load, dinners to be made, grass to be mowed, emails to answer. But here's the thing. When we think about the past, many of the difficult or mundane tasks, those details that color and make up our normal everyday life, the annoyances, the concerns, they're not the first thing that come to mind. Rather, it's all the good times we have or have had. Singer and piano player Billy Joel, here's another blast from the past, right? In one of his hit songs, here's the lyrics, and maybe you're familiar with this song. He says, "Do you remember those days hanging out at the village green? Engineer boots, leather jackets, and tight blue jeans. Drop a dime in the box, play a song about New Orleans. Cold beer, hot lights, those sweet romantic teenage nights." When we look back at the past, it's generally done wearing a pair of rose-colored glasses. But there's another important factor, reason that the past is so alluring for us. Why we desire the old normal. And it's this. We know how things turned out. We know how things turned out, which makes it less stressful. And I don't think anyone would argue that uncertainty is stressful. Not knowing can raise a whole bunch of concern. And in this pandemic, we're faced with more uncertainty than any time in recent history. It just seems to be all compacted because we're going through so much change. Every day the numbers are changing and the news is changing and what we can do and what we can't do. There's uncertainty when it comes to our jobs, our health. And all of that in turn puts stress onto our relationships. And so to cope, we reminisce about the good old days. In our minds, we go back to a time when life was simpler, easier, better. Even though in reality, those days were just as full of uncertainty as today. Now, this isn't anything new. This isn't come to the fore of everything just because of this pandemic. This has been around probably since humankind has roamed the earth. There's a story in the Bible that absolutely illustrates this beautifully. It's a story from the Old Testament, in the second book of the Bible, in Exodus, Genesis, Exodus. And it's an unbelievable story. It's a page-turner. And I'd encourage you to read it. We're just going to kind of skim through some of it. But it's the story of when God rescued the Israelites from slavery at the hands of the Egyptians. You know, at one time, just to give you some background on this story, at one time the Egyptians and the Israelites were coexisting together. But then the Israelites started to multiply. They were having lots of kids, and their numbers were starting to grow. And the Egyptian Pharaoh, the guy that was in charge, started to get a little bit nervous, thinking, they're starting to outnumber us. And if there's a war, they may side with our enemies and help take us over. And so, out of his fear and his insecurity, he changes the game. And it says, so the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They, the Egyptians, were ruthless in all their demands. Imagine that. It's a brutal, harsh, hard existence. And so the Israelites cry out to God to rescue them. And God hears them, and he does just that, and he does it in spectacular fashion. After a bunch of back and forth between Pharaoh and the leader of the Israelites, a guy named Moses of Ten Commandments fame, they have this bunch of back and forth. Let my people go. I won't let your people go. Back and forth they go. Finally, Pharaoh gets fed up and he says, fine, get out of here. Get your people and go. And so one night they get up and they leave. And they figure they're almost home free, when suddenly they find themselves trapped between the Egyptian army, who all of a sudden, one day Pharaoh's like, what did we just do? We just let all our slave labor go. That was a bad move. Let's go get them and bring them back. And so that's what they did, and they went after them. And the Israelites find themselves trapped between the Egyptian army and a piece of water called the Red Sea. And things look grim. They're up against it. But at the last possible moment, God rescues them. And he does it by parting the waters of the Red Sea. And the Israelites run through on dry ground. The Egyptians show up and they figure, hey, you guys can do it, so can we. And so in they go, and they follow. But as they're making their way across, their chariots get stuck, their horses are all stuck, there's mass confusion, and God closes the waters over and wipes out the Egyptian army. Again, it's a fantastic story. If you've never cracked the Bible open, man, it's a great place to start. It really is. But that day, the Israelites crossed over into a new normal, into a new way of life. They went from slave to free, from bondage to freedom. And so what did they do? They partied. They did. Read the whole next chapter. It's full of celebration, songs of celebration that they sang in response to their newfound freedom, their new life, their new normal. But get this. About a month after this incredible, awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping rescue from a life of slavery, a journey where God showed up again and again and dramatically confirmed that he saw their suffering and went to great lengths to set them free. Listen to what happens. It says this: in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses, the leader of the Israelites, and Aaron, his helper. And the Israelites said to them, listen to this, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. 30 days. 30 days. And the thrill of this new life is just evaporated into the hot desert air. And the people formed a Back to Egypt committee of sorts. And they said, remember the good old days in Egypt? We had plenty to eat then. We had meat to cook for our families. We had plenty of good bread. Now here we are out in this hot desert, living in tents and starving to death. And just like us, the members of the Back to Egypt committee have very selective memory. They've forgotten how a harsh Egyptian pharaoh and his taskmasters forced them to toil for long hours in the broiling sun, forced them to make bricks without straw, forced them to push and pull heavy equipment, and to build whatever pharaoh demanded be built. Back in Egypt, there's no such thing as a long weekend or a day off. They didn't have pots full of meat or unlimited bread. If and when they did have something to eat, they ate when they were told they could eat. You know, when life is difficult, and life is unpredictable, it can be tempting for us to want to go back to the good old days, to the old normal where things are predictable. But doing that, can keep us from seeing and enjoying the provision and the freedom that Christ makes available to you and to me today. We all want to get back to normal, to the way our lives were before. We want to visit whom we want to visit when we want to visit them. We want to be able to go out and buy food without having to wear a mask and gloves, to not cancel weddings and graduations, and basically not catch a potentially life-threatening virus because someone moved within 6 feet of us and cleared their throat. But here's a question. Here's something to think about. What if these strange days that we find ourselves in is an opportunity? An opportunity for us to reevaluate what has and hasn't been working in our old normal, our old lives. The Apostle Paul, we talk about him a lot at the meeting place. He went from basically a Jesus follower killer to a Jesus follower. And he ended up writing a bunch of letters to some churches he planted around the Mediterranean rim. And in one of these letters that now make up almost half of the New Testament of the Bible, he was writing to some first century Christians in the city of Rome who were kind of struggling, going back to the way things were and all the uncertainty. And so he penned these words. He said, "We know that in all things," and by the way, the Greek word for all is all. It means everything. "We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him." And I got to say, I believe that. I do. I believe that God can work through all things, including a global pandemic. I believe God can work through me having less freedom to do what I want when I want. I believe God can work through every single life experience that we encounter, even though we can't see how it's all going to work out. And I sit here, I guess I'm not standing, but I don't pretend to know how or why God chooses to work that way. I don't. But one thing I do know, and here's why I don't know why God chooses to work that way, because God's God and I'm not. But oftentimes I forget that. And I take control of things, and I want things to go my way. When it doesn't, I kind of wondered, what is he up to? Why would this happen? Why are we going through a global pandemic? What's the point? Now, you might not believe that. You might be sitting there saying, I don't know, that's a bit of a stretch for me. Totally okay, I get that. That's what I love about, just hang with me for a second, okay? And consider this. Just go with, it's true that God can work through all things. If that's true, if God can use all things and work them for our good, then what if in the midst of this strange time that we find ourselves in, God has lovingly pressed the pause button on the madness of our old normal? What if God is leveraging this disruption to get our attention right now? What if God is lovingly whispering into your ear and my ear, and what he's saying is, hey, that old normal, it wasn't working for you. Your schedule was killing not just you, but your relationships with your kids and your significant other, your friends. You were going nonstop. And there was zero room in your life to slow down and experience real peace and rest. What if God is saying, I want to introduce you to a new normal, a different, better way of life? What if God is lovingly saying to you and I want to rescue you from the things that are enslaving you in your old normal, just like I did with the Egyptians? What if God is gently and lovingly urging you and I to use these strange times to really look at and evaluate our old normal? To take off the rose-colored glasses so we can see the changes that we would benefit from and be wise to make. So we can live the life that we all long for. A life with more margin financially, emotionally, time-wise. Imagine having margin in your schedule. A life with more space, more peace, more grace, more freedom. A life where you and I don't have to look to our performance or our job or our bank account or our accomplishments to find our identity or self-worth. What if? What if? So we can enjoy a life where we have better aligned our priorities so we can experience deeper and more meaningful relationships with our children, with our significant other, with our friends, with our classmates, with our coworkers, and God himself. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be diving in and we're going to be looking at the idea that maybe the gift in this pause, because it's really easy to look at this as like an obstacle, a pain, but what if it's a gift? This pause that we've all experienced, and it's far more reaching than we might have even begun to imagine. And take a look at what life could be like as we emerge into this new normal. Really glad you're here with us. I invite you to pray. God, we are in some strange times. And it can leave us scratching our head, raising an eyebrow on why is all this stuff happening? And maybe, just maybe, you're working behind the scenes and you're using this time to get us to, while we're slowed down, while we're paused, while we've stepped out of our old normal, that we can really evaluate what was working and what wasn't working in our old lives. And sometimes it can be hard to hold up that mirror and take a deep look. But we know that you're good and that you can be trusted and you want what's best for us. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean doing this is going to be simple. But that's what you want for us. That's what you desire for us. And so I just pray for myself that you would give me the courage to really look at the things that I need to look at, that I might need to change so I can be better moving into this new normal that we find ourselves entering into. We thank you that you loved us first, so much so that you were willing to go to any length to giving yourself to us to rescue us from ourselves. Thank you. And we pray all of this in your awesome name. Amen.